In the Chimera Ants arc, humans' personality traits, as well as some of their deeds, allowed them to vanquish the ants. These personality traits and other attributes were passed to the ants by their queen after she devoured humans. Then mankind faced these creatures with some weapons which were already at the center of its own conflicts. So humans affected the ants' development indirectly and also fought them head-on. And those two types of actions led them to victory. Chimera ants are a special type of ants because their queen, after eating other living beings, can give their physical features to her descendants. In return, the children take care of hunting, and the queen needs more and more food to increase the size of her army, but especially to give birth to a powerful king, which is her main objective. Chimeras always follow their mother's orders and bring her everything she wants. They are social insects, and the queen and the colony are usually their priorities. However, the species the hunters would fight was big enough to eat humans, and by consuming such prey, the queen of the ants allowed her offsprings to inherit both humans' psychological traits and physical features. One can argue that these new beings are humans who have been reincarnated into chimera ants. Some could remember their past, even though it varied according to the individual. But whether or not they remembered anything, one's temper could influence the ant the person became. Personal desires such as requesting the queen's permission to have names and wearing not only clothes, but also having different clothing styles, can be interpreted as signs of human influence on many of these ants. When he was born, the king mortally wounded the queen and then left the castle looking for food with his royal guards, without caring for the rest of the chimera ants. The queen eventually died from her injuries, and the king stood alone at the top of chimera ants' hierarchy. But between the king's birth and the queen's passing, some ants chose to leave as well, following in the king's footsteps, whereas others stayed by the queen's side. Let's call the ones who stayed members of the first group. Most of them felt closer to the queen than the others, and some were able to remember their past. So they were more likely aware that the queen ate them when they were human and turned them into ants. This just shows how strong the ant bond is, and that bond is probably the main reason why some chose to stay with the queen until her last breath. Moreover, all the ants created from humans because of their new appearance couldn't merely go back to living with mankind, although there are some exceptions who will be discussed later. After the battle, the surviving ants would even be classified as new Maju, not humans. That was a political decision to avoid any new crises with man, so their bond, and maybe the way they looked, could have made them stay with the queen, but since they were influenced by their human side, it's possible that they still possessed their free will. If so, they could have chosen to stay in the castle just because they wanted to. Indeed, the division commander who revealed to the hunters that some ants could remember their past implied that this particularity was linked to their ability to speak. The fact of the matter is that they had to formulate thoughts in order to speak, just like humans. So if they could think like humans, then they were capable of reasoning and making choices, meaning deciding by themselves. All of this would explain Koala's case because, even though he didn't follow his original division and remained in the castle instead, he didn't show any particular interest for the queen either, so he took a personal decision using his free will. However, some chimeras having memories didn't necessarily mean that they remembered absolutely everything about their past life. Those in this situation would probably not know where to go even if they had wanted to leave. About that, one section of this video was supposed to be about Koruto and Reina, the first two humans that the Queen of the Ants ate, but I'll make a separate video for them. In the meantime, let's just keep in mind that their former lives influenced who they became, like many other victims of the Queen. The main reason why many Chimera ants left the castle was the division commanders and even the squad captains' desire to imitate the king and create their own kingdoms according to Koruto. When he surrendered to the hunters in hopes of getting their help to save the queen, he warned them that if she died, this is what would happen. Nov confirmed it by mentioning reports with a similar outcome. Among these Ents, that I'll call members of the second group, there was Rammot, a former squad captain in Koruto's division, and also division commanders like Welfin, Bloster, Pitou, Meleoron, Zazan, Leol, whose former name was Hagya, and a few others. Some would be followed by their own division soldiers, and even by soldiers who belonged to the divisions of the commanders of the first group. Members of the second group tended to do what they wanted, which was contrary to Chimera norms. They must have retained the personalities that they had when they were human, which consequently could have reinforced their desire to leave, given that this was already a possible scenario for ants which had lost their queen. And in this case, the ants left before the queen even died, and not after, as Nov stated. This is what Koruto found out when he returned to the castle with a medical team. Leol and Zazan had informed everyone that the queen could no longer procreate and maintain a kingdom. Their words triggered the premature action of the ants of the second group. Welfin is a chimera from the second group who got his memory back, just like Meleoron, whose role will be explained at a later point. To go back to Welfin, he was able to remember his past pretty soon. This means that at the time of departure, it could have influenced him and given him another reason to leave. But the thing is, members of the first group are chimera ants too. If creating one's own kingdom when the queen dies is a chimera attribute, why didn't some of them feel the need to do so? As mentioned previously, they had a stronger bond with the queen. However, it is also possible that the humans they were created from were already very loyal and caring, and that these new beings inherited more of their former selves' qualities than their flaws. Maybe that contributed to make them stay or not want to create their own kingdoms. During the queen's days, Leol and Pitou, who were individualists like humans, and who also possessed predators' genes, hunted for fun. It's worth noting that Leol knew that he was a lion. This confirms that chimera ants can also have access to memories of the other species they were created from. With that being said, according to Pitou, him and Leol would make an effort to deliver the number of preys demanded by the queen, although he admitted to Koruto that this number was approximative. What it means is that, somewhere, some ants of the second group did share a bond with the queen. It's just that theirs was not strong enough, or that influences of species from which they were formed, selfish humans and/or other animals, were even stronger. Since Leol never mentioned his human past, it's easy to think that that's because he wasn't a human. But his personality as well as his clothing style tend to prove that he was, and the same can be applied to other ants which showed signs of individualism and/or manifested their preferences. Chimeras with stronger forces of will tended to have more memories of their past. So in Leol's case, one way to interpret this statement is that he was able to get his lion's memory back, lions being less developed or less intelligent than humans, but was not strong enough mentally to recover his human memory. What I mean by that is that Leol probably didn't evoke his human past not because he wasn't one, but rather because he couldn't remember who he was before. Of course, the fact that he had predator genes can explain why he would want to keep some prey for himself, but if his human temper also had an effect on him, even to a small degree, that confirms that chimera ants with no human memory could still be influenced by who they used to be. There were also special cases like Jairo who never developed any ant's bond with the queen. When he was a human, he wanted to spread evil throughout the world. His determination was so strong that he never forgot who he was. Welfin recovered his memory progressively, but Jairo never lost it in the first place. He didn't feel anything for the queen, and his king's pride made him leave the castle long before her kingdom was compromised. Another ant which left before this event was Yunju. I'll talk more about him shortly. In the second group, some individuals also admitted to not remember their past lives. Among the chimeras that wanted to imitate the king by creating their own kingdoms, some would resort to joining him and his royal guards in order to escape the hunters who were chasing them. That was the case of former division commanders like Leol, Welfin, and Bloster. In exchange, they would offer their services to the king, meaning that they did it by interest and not out of loyalty. There isn't even any distinct hierarchical relationship between the king and the division commanders. The soldiers who had followed their leaders would continue to get their orders from them. In each group, members acted as Chimera ants, whether it was by staying by the queen's side until the end, by wanting to become kings, since it was a predictable Chimera behavior, or even by following one's division commander that wanted to leave. But we can also say that a significant number of ants still in both groups were influenced by their human side, and some could remember who they were in their past lives. So human influence and ant conditions affected members of both groups differently. For the most part, ants from the second group were more attracted by the concept of freedom, while those from the first group had a greater sense of duty. The first group wanted to oppose the second's departure, but the latter outnumbered the former. Even though one can understand where ants from the first group are coming from, can we really blame those who wanted to leave? After all, the queen only cared for the king, and it wasn't even reciprocal. Even if she believed what Koruto told her when she asked about the king, when he wanted to come out, she said to him by telepathy that it was too soon, and he told her out loud to be quiet. She probably didn't understand his reply, but she did feel the pain that the king caused her when he cold-bloodedly pierced her belly. That didn't stop her from wanting to know how he was doing when she started to communicate again. It was her first concern. After he left the queen's castle, Yunju established his own territory. This act can be considered as an outright rejection of the queen's authority. Yunju went as far as enslaving humans. He definitely viewed them as inferior beings. According to Kaito, man's evil side mixed with Chimeras' hostile nature seemed to have made some ants eviler. Results of this deadly combination could be seen in many divisions, and they disrupted the ants' natural order. Ironically though, Chimera ants, which were hunting humans like it was a sport, briefly became the hunters, and humans had to take on the role of prey. About that, when the king went to East Korto, he asked some women who begged him to spare them if humans listened to the cries of the animals that they slaughtered. The consumption of human flesh by the queen, which individualized a significant number of Chimera ants, logically led to their disorganization. And during the queen days, in one of their conversations, Koruto and Peggy even thought that Nen made things worse as many ants became even more uncontrollable as a result. Just like their human individualist traits, their learning of Nen also caused disorder within their ranks. And as I'm about to explain in a moment, the soldier ants learnt it voluntarily. Pitou, one of the royal guards, was also one of the first Chimera ants to understand Nen principles. Most of the others were initiated to Nen following the guard's orders. Pitou let them know that in exchange, they would become stronger. This most likely motivated them even more to know about Nen. So the ants weren't just obeying Pitou. The reward they would get then justifies the idea that Chimeras wanted to learn Nen voluntarily, but learning it didn't reinforce their commitment to the queen as Pitou wanted, on the contrary. As an aside, Pitou didn't care much about the queen either. At that time, she had not birthed the king yet, and she needed to be protected. Stronger soldiers would have surely helped to do so. Once the king was born, the queen was no longer useful to the royal guards, who were only loyal to the king. Another quick point I want to make is that Pitou seemed to be communicating by telepathy with the soldiers. However, later on in the story, Pitou gave a phone to Leol saying that royal guards could not use telepathy. So there must have been a mistake, either within the English translation of the chapter or with the author's writing, because the texts and shapes of their bubbles suggest that the royal guard addressed the other ants using telepathy. But in any case, the result for the soldiers was the same. Besides Yunju, other examples of disobedience within Chimera ranks include Rammot, who defied the authority of his commander Koruto by insisting on satisfying his personal desires. As a way to legitimate his insubordination, he cited Leol's and Chitou's divisions as examples. He was even willing to get transferred just so he could do what he wanted. Indeed, as explained previously, Leol and Pitou were hunting for fun. Not only were they being unruly themselves by killing the queen's prey and leaving them behind, but they even encouraged their troops to do the same. So there were other Chimeras who were doing whatever they wanted, and this is what Rammot used to justify his wanting to get back at Gon and Killua. Both of them were rare prey for Chimera ants and would have been served imperatively to the queen because of their nutriments had they been captured. Even normal humans were paralyzed by poison and stored until feeding time. So what should be emphasized here is that Rammot not only wanted to kill Gon and Killua, but also eat them himself after what they did to him. He was clearly willing to break many Chimera rules by putting his interests before those of the queen. Leol's soldiers clearly showed that they were acting freely and on their own terms when they faced Gon, Killua, and Kaito in one-on-one battles, instead of cooperating like normal ants. According to Kaito, this was due to their human side, which he saw as an advantage. On top of this genetic heritage, the fact that their leader tolerated their behavior might have reassured them in their choices. After the second group of ants' departure, other members of Leol's division would try to beat Killua. They would also act individually, but upon realizing their mistake, they would attempt a collective attack before getting massacred for the most part. What's important here is that they understood themselves the importance of fighting together, like social insects would. Human influence altered the way Chimera ants were supposed to behave, to the point of creating disorder within their army. One can wonder why the queen ate humans in the first place, but more importantly, why she continued to do so. She needed bigger prey than the small animals she was feeding off of at first. She had to get better food for the king. So she ordered her first ants to bring it to her. One of them found 2 humans and captured them. Once consumed, they turned out to be very nutritious for the queen, which was the reason why she started craving human flesh. But that also explains her share of responsibility for what would happen to her people. And when she remarked that some Chimeras had personal desires, she was the first to understand that this could have a negative effect on them, even though she didn't know exactly what was going to happen. Then, some ants even expressed their concern regarding their fellow soldiers and how they were acting. However, the damage was already done because at the time of the queen's observation, most human-based Chimera ants were already born or about to. So even if she had stopped eating humans at that moment, it would have probably not prevented the disorganization from happening. But the queen would have continued eating them anyway because her main mission was to give birth to a powerful king, and she therefore had to do everything to provide him with the best food possible. Also, it's likely that the queen herself was slightly changed, because she eventually liked the idea of names and implied that this new interest was due to the human blood, which could have stayed in her. And if she was able to make this connection, it means that she must have understood that consuming human beings was the reason behind all the strange behaviors. Although such a deduction was normal coming from her since she knew where those nutriments that she used to create her ants came from. The queen even made the distinction between her and the generation of Chimeras that she gave birth to by calling it a strange bunch, almost like they were another species, or because their way of thinking and their conduct were not those of normal Chimera ants. To summarize, the fact that the queen continued to eat human flesh even after noticing her offspring's peculiarities was to ensure that she produced a powerful king, and rich elements like humans were going to help her do it. She felt that the king was destined to be great and instinctively focused only or mainly on that. The small doubts she might have had on the effects of this food would have not stopped her from reaching her goal, for which she ended up giving her life without any regrets. But besides her ant instinct, is it possible that human influence made her continue down this path? Let me rephrase it. Is that completely impossible that if there was some human blood in her body, it could have, despite its small quantity, made her stubborn to the point of doing what she pleased, thus ignoring her own doubts? This is just a theory, but if it were true, she would have been, to a lesser extent and not exactly in the same way, in the same situation as some of the chimeras that she created using humans, those ones having been influenced by their human side and their ant side at the same time. The main objective of this essay is to show that the chimeras lost due to humans' direct and indirect actions. Disorganization is an indirect effect man had on the ants because the fact that the queen ate human flesh was not an action intended by humans. But even if many divisions of their army had not been disorganized, most Chimera ants with the rank of commander or lower would have probably lost to the hunters. Indeed, given the difference in level, even if Leol's soldiers had collaborated from the start against Killua, the outcome would have not been very different, and the same observation can be made about the previous group that had faced Gon, Killua and Kaito. Kaito in particular had no problem to dissuade or eliminate division commanders. So the parts human influence on the soldiers and disorganization are mainly there to generally establish the presence of human behaviors within soldier ants, as well as the negative impact this human factor had on those insects. If Kaito wasn't worried about soldier ants, the royal guards and above them the king were a different story, although it was too late when he found out. So for the hunters, the real danger came from these exceptional monsters, as only one of them could beat a fighter of Kaito's caliber without even having developed its Hatsu. This is why their loss was the Chimera ants' loss in general, thus ensuring mankind's victory, and they too, three of them to be precise, had human genes which I think contributed to their defeat. So the fact that they were also influenced by humans is part of humanity's indirect actions. But before talking about it, I need to mention two chimeras who were very useful to humans: Ikalgo, a former soldier in Leol's division, and Meleoron, who himself was a former division commander. There are often collaborators in wars and other conflicts, and these two played that role during the battle between humans and chimera ants. Each had his own reasons. Ikalgo was moved by Killua's words. The young boy told him that they could have been friends under different circumstances. Ikalgo ended up switching sides and following him. About Meleoron, he remembered that Peggy was his foster parent when they were human. Since the king killed Peggy, Meleoron wanted revenge, and that made him change sides. He first befriended Gon. Gon and Killua then let him and Ikalgo join the group. So one's feelings and the other's memory prove that Ikalgo and Meleoron were influenced by their human side, to the point of betraying their fellow chimeras. They would take part in the invasion during the final battle and use their powers to help humans. Meleoron's abilities in particular contributed to humans' victory, in other words, to the ants' defeat. Thanks to his invisibility, his teammate Knuckle was able to cause some damages to Youpi, another one of the royal guards, without being noticed for a moment, which kept the ant busy and prevented it from joining the king early. The goal of the assault was to separate the guards from the king to allow Netero, the president of the Hunter Association, to carry out his mission, which he did at the cost of his life. Hunters were going to invade the king's palace on the day of gathering, the same day where the ants, namely Pouf, the other royal guard, were going to choose, through a selection, individuals among the people of East Gorto to turn them into soldiers' ants using Pouf's power. That's how they wanted to build the king's army. A little before the selection started, the king ordered everyone not to disturb him, but when the palace got attacked, because of the danger, Youpi would have most likely ignored the king's order, just like Pouf did, and also tried to look for him to assist or protect him. But he couldn't do any of that quickly. If Youpi had not been delayed by his fight with Knuckle, Meleoron and the others, Netero would have not succeeded, given that he was wondering when he first saw Pitou if that ant was stronger than him. So facing the king, who was even more powerful, plus one or more royal guards all at once was not conceivable. In Netero's body, there was a bomb which was the ultimate human weapon against Chimera ants. He was able to fight the king alone just as planned, and he eventually set off that bomb. Meleoron, who had switched sides after he remembered his human past, contributed to the success of this mission. I'll talk about the bomb again later in part 3, direct actions. For now, let's go back to the king, whose real name was Meruem. He did acknowledge, when he was talking to Netero, that human individualism was a problem. But Netero quickly noticed that a conflict existed in him. The king had two personalities, that of a human and that of an ant. A short while after he made the decision to have a selection, Meruem started playing board games as a way to pass the time according to him. Even though animals can get bored, in order to keep himself busy, he chose a human activity. His human side might have influenced him to do so because he could have done something else. In a short period of time he managed to beat champions of various games before encountering Komugi, the Goon Gift champion. Despite his incredible skills and the speed with which he was improving, he could never beat her. This intrigued him because up until that point he had always ended up winning. This repetitive taste of defeat was new to him, and although that made him feel anxious, he was also enjoying that situation. He couldn't find out what he was feeling the most. The meeting of Meruem and Komugi created a relationship between the two. This eventually led the king of the Chimera ants to do something unexpected and unnatural. The circumstances of their meeting, the nature of their relationship, and this unforeseen action were, I think, influenced by his human side and contributed to the ants' defeat. During one of their games, the king ripped his left arm apart for Komugi. Such behavior was way different than the one he had when he was born. He should have not done something like that for a mere human, nor even for one of his guards who only existed to protect him. For Meruem, that was his way to ask for forgiveness. Indeed, he had tested Komugi's determination with a bet. The incident happened after he had realized that even though losing was something unpleasant, he was still enjoying it. He offered to give Komugi everything she wanted if she was to win the game that they were playing, but if he were the winner, she would have to give him her left arm. Komugi didn't even know what she wanted if she'd win and told the king that she would think about it after playing. However, the young woman was willing to give her own life if she lost. His bet was a way for the king to try to destabilize her. Using fear and desire, he hoped that she would make mistakes so he could win. With his previous opponents, he was able to disrupt their rhythm, and that's how he was beating them. He was doing so while playing, but it didn't work on Komugi, who was on a whole different level, so he wanted to use external elements which could have distracted her instead. The problem was that she had no fear nor desires. Meruem had misjudged her, and this is why he offered her his left arm, the same arm he wanted from her. This act can be interpreted as a sign of honor or pride. As a matter of fact, when Pouf wanted the king to stop playing so he could be healed properly, he told him that interrupting the game would force him to go back on his word, which would shame him. This shows that not only did he know what honor was, but he actually cared about it. The thing is, honor is a human concept, and this, I think, also proves Meruem's human influence. But what followed the king's ripping off his own arm was just as surprising, if not more, because Meruem, who didn't want to receive any treatments, changed his mind after Komugi refused to continue to play. He threatened to kill her, but since she was not afraid to die, that didn't work, and the king had no other choice but to give in, something that had never happened before. But what does any of it have to do with the ants' defeat? Pitou, who was watching over the palace and its surroundings using N, had to take care of the king's wounds. Each of these activities required a lot of energy, but the king was the priority, so Pouf replaced Pitou to monitor the facility. The problem was that Pouf's N range was inferior to Pitou's, which allowed Nov, one of the hunters, to infiltrate the palace and create exits using his power. This is how the invasion team got into the palace and kept the royal guards, namely Youpi and Pouf, away from the king, at least for a moment. Again, they helped Netero to carry out his mission because these two ants would have done everything to stay by the king's side if they could have joined him before he left the palace. But before the day of the invasion and the selection, the king, who accepted to receive treatments, continued to play with Komugi. The more he was spending time with her, the more he was getting close to her. Even his guards realized that he had changed ever since that human arrived. At some point though, Meruem tried to convince himself that losing at Gungiv didn't mean anything. Even if Komugi was better than him in that domain, he was still way stronger than her physically and could easily beat her. He wanted to believe in the power of violence and decided to go and kill Komugi, only to find birds attacking her. He immediately got rid of them, and having noticed her wounds, the king, who looked worried, asked Komugi why she didn't call for help. The girl replied that she didn't want to bother him. He told her that she could not bother him because she was an important guest. The king was surprised by the words he was saying. It's true that it was the first time that he showed so much concern for someone else. A deep affection for her was growing in Meruem. Him, who initially came to her room to kill her, saved her instead. Maybe there was a little bit of frustration in the monologue he had before, because he couldn't beat her at Gungiv. If there was something where Komugi could never beat Meruem, it was fighting. So he wanted to believe that only violence mattered to somehow console himself, but having seen her wounds made him understand just how weak she was. Later, in his discussion with Netero, he revealed that he was going to use his strength to protect the weak and not to oppress them, contrary to what he used to think. Still, the fact that he saved her and told her that she was important shows the evolution of their relationship, or that he was starting to view her differently. He could hardly believe his own words and didn't understand why he'd saved her nor what he wanted to do with her because, from a Chimera standpoint, his behavior was contrary to their true nature and to what was expected from the king, who wasn't supposed to care for a human. Thus we can suppose once again that his human side influenced him. And it's because Komugi mattered so much to him that the first thing he did during the Hunter's invasion was to go and check on her. She had been seriously injured by Zeno's attack as the old man didn't know that she was inside the palace, and even he and Nitaro could tell that Meruem cared for Komugi. After entrusting Komugi to Pitou, he agreed to follow Nitaro and Zeno. If he hadn't changed and started to care for Komugi due to his human side, which even made him change his vision for the future, that same vision he told Nitaro about, which means that he had initially preferred to talk with him rather than fight. Even though the hunter had launched an assault on his palace which resulted in harming his important guest, would he have firstly checked on Komugi and secondly decided to move to a different location, not only to discuss but also to somewhat avoid having to potentially fight near her, thus ensuring that she would receive proper treatments instead of killing his enemies right then and there? Thanks to Meruem agreeing to move, Netero could bring him exactly where he wanted him to be in order to use the bomb. Although the king figured out almost all of their plan, he couldn't know everything Netero had in mind, so the choice that he made, motivated by the human element, led him and two of his guards to their downfall. The irony is that caring for somebody and saving them are good things, but the way the king acted had a negative impact on Chimera ants as a whole. In a nutshell, the king, out of boredom, started playing board games, a human activity. Thanks to that, he met Komugi and became close to her progressively. His honor made him rip off his own arm, which facilitated the hunter's assault, which in turn allowed them to keep two of his guards away. Being preoccupied by Komugi, who got injured again, he entrusted her to Pitou and left the palace alongside Netero, separating himself even further from his loyal servants. Netero was then able to accomplish his mission. If Youpi was near the hunters when the attack started, it's because the exit point that they used was the closest one created by Nov, and it was located near the stairs to the first floor. Meanwhile, these stairs had become Youpi's new post. This circumstance was beneficial to the hunters who didn't waste time looking for him. As the day of the selection was approaching, it seemed like the king could no longer put up with the presence of his guards. When he officially ordered not just them but also the other ants not to approach him, Pouf suggested that Youpi stayed in the stairs to the first floor so as to still be able to stop any potential intruders, hence his new position. Pitou was watching one part of the palace as well as the outside using N, and Pouf was going to use his own power to make sure that the selection went well. But why was the king reacting this way? Humans noticed that some royal guards were not inside the palace. Moro thought the king might have wanted some privacy in order to mate. There was indeed a woman in the king's entourage, and even though Meruem had feelings for Komugi, this was not the type of relationships that they had when they were living in the palace. With that being said, hunters managed to figure out quite a lot of things, like the reason why Pitou had stopped using N, the presence of a woman, and why the king would hurt himself. Meruem and Komugi were not playing together when he gave his order. They were not playing either when humans were speculating. The group was discussing right before launching the assault, and Meruem and Komugi were not together at that moment since he joined her when the attack started. They were probably taking a break from playing Goon Give. As a reminder, I think Meruem's human genes made him play board games, which led him to meet and get close to Komugi. And this is how he started to change. Him not wanting to be disturbed by the guards was part of that change, so this legitimates human influence as the reason behind Youpi's new post. He was quite far from the king, and that allowed the hunters to keep him that way, which then facilitated Nitero's mission and contributed to the Chimeras' defeat. Indeed, Youpi started guarding the stairs following Pouf's advice, but it was due to the king's order. So even this unexpected encounter between him and the invasion team would have been the result of human influence and in the end was detrimental to the ants. This sounds more logical to me as an explanation than the moments which preceded the king's order. Before warning Youpi and then forbidding everybody to come near him when he talked to Pitou, Meruem was reflecting. Translations vary, but from what I understand, the king, at that moment, seemed to have accepted his fate and was ready to rule as a real Chimera ant. His state of mind was similar to the one he had before he wanted to kill Komugi. But of course he showed his human side when he witnessed the young girl's vulnerability. The moment when he was talking about his fate happened after he saved Komugi and before the humans attacked. And as mentioned previously, he went and checked on her when they invaded, so his human affection was back. Then he would talk to Nitero about protecting the weak. Nitero wasn't living in the palace with him, but he understood that the king had two personalities. Since Meruem was a Chimera ant which possessed human genes, this is not that surprising, but the fact that his explanation about fate precedes the order that he gave is problematic because one could think that they are linked. Meaning that the monologue about fate could be the reason behind the fact that he wanted to be left alone. But this is not very coherent. If the king wanted to act like a Chimera, why would he want his guards to stay away from him? And it wasn't just Pitou's end that bothered him, since he also forbade the other ants from getting close. This is why I think that Meruem's excitement and his exacerbation don't have much to do with one another, and that a human like Komugi, who was already at the root of the king's changing, is a way better explanation for such an order. But it's true that before this decision, Youpi had already noticed that the king was irritated. So him being irritated again could have just been a more general and recurring phenomenon that would then explain why he wanted to be left alone and gave this order, instead of someone in particular being the reason for it. But the question is, would Meruem have acted this way if he had never met Komugi? Another argument in favor of the girl will be brought in a moment when I talk about Pouf and his own human influence. About Youpi, he was the only royal guard which had been created using a Maju instead of a human. This revelation confirms that the other two had human genes. Pouf even developed a typical human feeling, jealousy. For a royal guard ant, it is normal to consider any creature that gets close to the king as a potential danger for him, but Pouf quickly noticed that the king was changing because of Komugi. He didn't like Meruem's affection for that human. He was thinking so much about the influence she had on him that he almost killed her because of an error of judgment. When the king ordered everyone not to get close to him, Youpi thought that the king had a bad temper because he was losing at Gungiv, but Pouf was thinking about something else. He was alluding to one of his predictions. Before he went to Komugiv thinking he was going to kill her, the king had spoken to his guards and he told them that she made him understand that there were different types of strengths. For example, Komugiv was excellent at Gungiv. Meruem realized that the child he killed when he arrived in East Gorto could have surpassed him in something. When he heard that, Pouf feared the king was having regrets. I think that Pouf was referring to these apprehensions that he had when the king spoke to him and the other two guards. He was even afraid to use his power to verify if he was right. He was released when the king concluded his speech by saying that only violence mattered, but since Meruem was lying to himself, I think that Pouf's suspicions were in fact founded. So even without knowing what happened between Meruem and Komugi when he went to her room, the fact that the king suddenly wanted to push the ants away reminded Pouf of those concerns, which could be summarized as this. The king was changing because of Komugi. His mood swings and or the order he gave were not due to the simple fact that he was losing at Gungiv, as Youpi thought, or to an attitude more in tune with Chimera domination. Why not? Because neither of those reasons would have made Pouf so anxious. A human who already had something to do with the fact that Meruem was changing is a way better explanation in my opinion. So, if the anxious thoughts that Pouf had when Youpi made his suggestion were really about Komugiv, it means that her and Meruem's human influence which caused the two to meet in the first place are the reasons behind the king's decision, or at the very least they are connected to it. Consequently, Youpi had to stay in the stairs instead of being close to the king, and that contributed to the ants' defeat, as explained previously. Again, Pouf could have checked if he was right using his power, but he was afraid to do so. And if he was suspecting that Meruem had feelings for Komugiv and that they were growing stronger, this could mean in his mind that the king was moving away from his guards in general, and from him in particular, and not just figuratively but literally as well because of the order. Now, if all of this is true, then Pouf wasn't just a royal guard watching over the king like the other two. He was also a jealous individual. At the same time, Komugiv did represent an obstacle to Chimera supremacy since the king changed his vision because of her. But even though Pouf wasn't around when the king talked to Netero, he already knew that he was changing because of Komugiv. So if he just wanted to make sure that the king successfully conducted his mission without any distraction like he pretended during the battle, he would have not gone as far as imagining a world only for him and Meruem, without including Pitou and Youpi, who were not obstacles to the domination of the ants. Indeed, Pouf wanted to build the king's kingdom without Pitou's help and didn't mention Youpi in his vision. In his own terms, this would be the king's and his kingdom, putting himself at the same level as Meruem and not counting his fellow guards. He wanted to keep the king all for himself. He had come to the conclusion that he would no longer need Pitou because of an experiment which had gone wrong, but since he chose only himself to be by the king's side in the end, I think that his project was a selfish ambition born out of an extreme jealousy, which made Pouf consider anyone, human or ant, as a threat or a rival, and that he was willing to use any pretext to achieve his goal. However, Komugi remained the main cause of this feeling. Pouf kept it for a long time because he tried to kill the girl again when fighting the hunters. But how did Pouf's human jealousy contribute to the Chimera ants' defeat? When he realized that the palace was under attack, Pouf rushed to the throne room where the king was supposed to be, except that he wasn't, and Pouf then went into a sort of trance. The fact that Meruem was missing wasn't part of the scenario which was to absolutely take place. In his mind, things were supposed to go exactly the way he wanted, not just his own actions but the king's too. This idealism can be correlated with the ideal world he would want to create for him and the king. Deep down he knew that Meruem was with Komugi, but didn't want to recognize it, and he deliberately headed in the wrong direction. One could still think that Pouf's animosity towards her was simply due to the fact that she was a human, but he admitted to himself that he didn't want to see Meruem with her, which proved his jealousy. Moreover, even if Youpi wasn't against killing her, he wasn't as hostile as Pouf towards Komugi. Pitou didn't despise her either and did follow the king's will by healing her. Later on in the story, Pouf said to himself that getting rid of Komugi was what the queen would have wanted. Even though it's probably true because the influence that this human had on Meruem was a problem for Chimera ants, it was made clear that royal guards only served the king, and when he was born, they all abandoned the queen, meaning that they didn't really care about her. This is why I think that, once again, Pouf was just using a pretext, this time the queen's intentions, to justify his own desires and actions. So every time that he was claiming to act in the king's interests by trying to get rid of Komugi, or just thinking about it, he had ulterior motives too. He himself wanted to see her disappear. Before, Pouf was anxious because he thought the king was changing with the presence of Komugi. But in the throne room he was forced to face the reality he was running away from. This time he didn't have the option to not use his power to have confirmation. His doubts were no longer just in his head. They were very real because Meruem, the king of the ants, had not only changed because of her but was so worried about this mere human that he took upon himself to go and visit her, and that was more than Pouf could bear. But then, he told himself that he didn't deserve the title of royal guard since he had failed in his mission. As a royal guard, he was supposed to assist the king during the attack, meaning that he had to go where the king actually was in order to do so. But he preferred to go where he wanted him to be instead, even though he knew his true location. Pouf chose to believe a reality that was more convenient for him, so he didn't fulfill his duty and was blaming himself for it. Though it's worth noting that it wasn't the last time that he wouldn't act as a regular guard because he would again put his own interests first later on in the story. Nonetheless, Pouf felt distraught, not just because of his failure but also because Meruem was still having consideration for Komugi. He couldn't stand the fact that his king was giving her that much attention. He didn't think she deserved it. I would even say that he wanted Meruem to treat him like he did Komugi. So the king of the ants couldn't have one of his royal guards near him because of a human flaw jealousy. Pouf's presence would have compromised Nitero's plans. Of course, Meruem could have told Pouf to stay out of his business and not to accompany them outside the palace. But Pouf had already showed in the past that he was willing to disobey the king and was prepared to face the consequences. A similar situation would even happen at the end of the battle. Anyway, with one or more royal guards by the king's side, like I said before, things would have been complicated for Nitero and he would have not been able to secure mankind's victory. So Pouf's human influence definitely played a role in the ants' defeat. It also caused his encounter with Moro, one of the hunters. He managed to hold him long enough for the king and Nitero to leave. That was part of their plan, so it contributed to their enemy's loss too. Moro could somehow find him and trap him in his smoke jail because Pouf was still in the throne room, blaming himself for his mistake. If just after realizing it he had headed in the king's direction, maybe he could have redeemed himself and avoided getting trapped by Moro as well. Sadly for him, his mental state didn't allow him to do either one of those things. Indeed, even if he had stayed in the throne room, I think his normal self would have spotted Moro approaching, and the hunter would have not been able to use his power to delay the ants joining the king. But again, Pouf was too upset for that. It's important to keep in mind that none of these events would have happened if he had not been so jealous of Komugi to begin with. Without having been influenced by his human flaw, it's certain that he would have headed straight towards the king when the attack started. The only guard who could join the king before his departure was Pitou, despite Nitero's attempt to keep the ant away from Meruem to facilitate his mission. The king tasked Pitou to heal Komugi and then left with Nitero. Shortly after this, Gon and Killua found Pitou. Gon wanted Pitou to bring Kaito back to normal, but the guard was already busy taking care of Komugi. After some tough negotiations, Gon ended up accepting that Pitou attended to Komugi first. When it was time to go to Kaito's location, Pitou suggested that they took Komugi with them, but Gon threatened to kill her. The young hunter was on his guard, so Pitou decided not to kill him at that moment. The ant thought there would be more occasions on the way. That's when the other humans arrived and Knuckle asked Gon if he should use his power on Pitou, but Gon told him that it wasn't necessary. He knew that Pitou wouldn't try anything because he trusted the ant, just like Pitou would have to trust him when he said that Knuckle was going to protect Komugi until they found Kaito. In fact, Gon was just using Komugi as a hostage to force Pitou to behave. So the ant had no choice but to do what he wanted and reluctantly left the palace with Gon. Right before seeing him, Pitou received a call from Welfin, who told the royal guard that he had gotten Komugi back from the hunters and made Pitou listen to her voice as proof. Gon was talking to Pitou at the same time, so the ant replied understood, as if the answer was for the boy. The voice that Pitou heard actually belonged to Pouf, who had used his power to pretend to be Komugi, and thus tricked Pitou with Welfin's help. If Pitou knew that Komugi was safe and sound, the ant could fight Gon without any constraints, and Pouf wanted to use this situation to force Killua and Palm to give Komugi to him. In exchange, he said that he would stop Pitou, which he would have probably not done, but in any case, his blackmail didn't work because Killua got rid of the ant, or more precisely one of his clones. Then Killua ran after Gon and Pitou, leaving Komugi with Palm, who swore that she wouldn't let Pouf take her. Upon laying eyes on Kaito, Pitou recognized him and revealed to Gon that he was already dead. Kaito died when they fought and Pitou's power couldn't bring him back to life. It could only manipulate his corpse and stop it from rotting. Gon blamed himself for Kaito's death, and then, overwhelmed by anger and the feeling of having been betrayed by Pitou, who didn't keep the promise that the ant had made him, he released an incredible amount of aura that somehow made him evolve to a level where he could beat Pitou. According to Killua and Moro, it was probably a Nen contract, so Gon and Pitou started their fight, and it concluded with the hunter's victory and the royal guard's death. There is no doubt that Gon vanquished this powerful enemy thanks to his own strength, and the young boy is therefore responsible for killing Pitou. But the guard made a decision at the beginning of the Chimera Ant's arc that led to this situation. Back in the Queen's castle, that ant willingly left its post after spotting Kaito. Royal guards were supposed to watch the castle, or more precisely the king who was still inside the Queen's body. Pitou made that clear by telling Koruto and Peggy that the royal guards would watch the inside of the castle while the others took care of the outside. Although it's true that soldier ants couldn't do much against a hunter of Kaito's caliber, meaning that it made more sense for someone like Pitou to fight him instead, he wasn't that close to the castle when the royal guard spotted him, so he wasn't a threat to the king yet. Therefore, I think that Pitou's coming out wasn't necessary. And because Pitou spoke about the royal guards protecting the inside after the altercation with Kaito, that doesn't mean that the ant got this idea at that very moment, in my opinion. Watching the castle meant protecting the king who was inside the queen's body. When the king left the castle after his birth, his royal guards followed him. They only existed to serve the king. They went where he went. However, when Pitou came out, the king was still inside the castle, so this is where all his royal guards were supposed to be as well, not outside. So protecting the inside of the castle as long as the king was still in it was their mission even before Kaito showed up, and not a precaution that Pitou would have thought about only after fighting him. Moreover, the ant admitted that it wanted to test its own strength. Satisfying this desire meant using free will, so I think that Pitou's human side played a role in it, rather than the ant's duty as a royal guard, because even though Kaito was quite far, one can still think that by sensing this strong opponent approaching, Pitou wanted to eliminate him as the king's safety was the royal guard's priority, regardless of how far or how close his enemies were. However, the king's safety was not what the ant was thinking about when it came out to confront the hunter. The proof of that is what Pitou said after killing him, confirming what the ant already knew. So it was a personal decision to come out. And unlike what Zeno and Netero would do later, Kaito had not launched a direct attack that could have potentially put the king in danger, thus prompting the royal guards to leave their post by coming out. So again, Pitou did that because the ant wanted to, not because it needed to. And that choice led to the attack on Kaito, which, in turn, made Gon hate Pitou and want the ant to fix his friend, hence the reason why Gon and Pitou left the king's palace during the battle. Then came the moment of telling Gon the truth about Kaito and finally, their long-awaited fight in which the ant died. When Gon and Pitou left the palace, Youpi along with Pouf's real body were with the king. Even if those two events didn't happen exactly at the same time, Pouf and Youpi were outside the palace before Pitou left it too. First, the ant couldn't join them because the king told Pitou to take care of Komugi, and then Pitou was forced to leave with Gon. In a scenario where that ant hadn't left its post in the queen's castle to attack Kaito in order to test its own strength, Pitou would have stayed in the king's palace during the battle against the hunters, which, let's suppose, would have taken place anyway. The guard's task would have still been to heal Komugi, but Pitou would have also had to fight all the hunters alone. Maybe even Kaito would have still been alive and taken part in the assault. Logically, there could have been three possible outcomes for Pitou. Outcome number 1. The ant would have successfully killed all the enemies. Even if Gon had been in the assault team, there is no guarantee that he would have made his Nen contract since nothing would have happened to Kaito beforehand. Or maybe he, or another one of Gon's friends would have been killed by Pitou during this battle in the king's palace, which would have prompted Gon to do it. Outcome number 2. The ant would have found a way to escape and reunite with the king. Outcome number 3. Pitou would have lost against all these hunters. In outcome number 3, Pitou's human influence would have probably not contributed to the guard's downfall. But in the story that we know, the ant willingly left its post and for personal reasons, which provoked a series of events that led to its death. Of course, the reason why Pitou followed Gon without protesting wasn't due to the ant's human genes but to Komugi, who had been entrusted to Pitou by the king. But the reason why the guard had to leave the palace was due to Kaito, that Pitou unnecessarily decided to fight in the past. And I think that the ant was influenced by its human side when that happened. Pitou killed Kaito and couldn't resurrect him. This situation caused by the royal guard made Gon go beyond his limits and completely smash his enemy. Meruem and his royal guards were the most powerful Chimera ants. They were on a different level than the others, and each ant in this powerful group, including Youpi, ended up in a situation, a position or a place which favored humans' global victory over their species. These incidents were made possible due to human behaviors and feelings expressed by Meruem, Pouf and Pitou. This is how and why the four of them were affected by human influence, and this was decisive for the outcome of the battle. It is important to note that all Chimera ants which were influenced by their human side were conscious individuals. They were responsible for their actions, so the first part of this video shouldn't be seen as an attempt to absolve them of that responsibility. Rather, it serves to explain some of the reasons why the ants lost by showing the impact that human influence had on them as an indirect action of mankind.